In the heart of Westeros, where three great rivers meet and flow as one toward the sea, there stands a castle that has witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, Riverrun. For thousands of years, this fortress has guarded the junction of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone, its red sandstone walls rising above the flowing waters, like a sentinel watching over the most fertile and most bloodied lands in all the Seven Kingdoms. And for centuries, one family has called this place home, House Tully, the Trout Lords of the Riverlands. But their story does not begin with glory. It begins with struggle. It begins in an age when the Riverlands belonged to no one and everyone, when 100 petty kings fought over every ford and every field, and when survival meant more than honor ever could. The origins of House Tully are lost in the mists of the Age of Heroes, that ancient time when the first men ruled Westeros and the children of the forest still walked beneath the weirwoods. The Meisters tell us little of those early Tullys. They were river lords, certainly, small holders with a strong castle and a bit of land. But they were not kings. They were not even great lords. In those days, the Riverlands had no single ruler. Dozens of houses claimed dominion over patches of territory. The Blackwoods and the Brackens fought their eternal blood feud. The Mallisters held the coast, the Frys controlled the crossing, and the Tullys held Riverrun. Even then, Riverrun mattered. Geography is destiny, the Masters say, and nowhere is this truer than in the Riverlands. The Red Fork flows down from the western hills. The Tumblestone rushes down from the north. Where they meet, a man who holds the crossing controls the center of Westeros. Every army marching east or west, north or south, must pass through these lands. Every trade road connects here. The Riverlands are the heart of the continent, and Riverrun is the heart of the Riverlands. But this centrality came with a terrible price, a price paid in blood and fire across thousands of years. The Tullys learned early that their position made them valuable. It also made them vulnerable. When great kingdoms rose around them, the Riverlands became the battlefield where those kingdoms met. The north pressed down from beyond the neck. The Vale Lords looked west from their mountain fastness. The Reach pushed north along the rivers. The Westerlands sent armies over the hills, and the Stormlands claimed the southern reaches of the Trident. Worst of all were the Ironborn. The Ironmen came in their longships, sailing up the rivers with axes and fire. They raided first, taking plunder and thralls. Then they conquered. The Iron Kings claimed the Riverlands as their territory, a source of wealth to feed their barren islands. For generations, the River Lords bent the knee to the Greyjoys and Hoares who ruled from the Iron Islands. They paid tribute in grain and gold. They watched their villages burned when that tribute came late. They learned to hate the sound of drums and the sight of sails upon the water. The Tullys survived this age of iron by bending. They gave what they had to give. They kept their heads low and their castle strong. Riverrun's walls were built high and thick. Its water gate could be opened to flood the ground around it, turning the castle into an island fortress that no army could easily take. When the Ironmen came with demands, the Tullys paid. When they came with swords, the Tullys retreated behind their walls and waited. And when they finally left, the Tullys emerged and rebuilt. This was not a glorious history. There were no great conquests, no legendary heroes, just survival, just endurance. But in the Riverlands, endurance was its own form of victory. The character of House Tully was forged in these centuries of submission and survival. They learned to be practical. They learned to pick their battles. They learned that sometimes the only way to protect your people was to bend the knee to whoever held the sword and to wait for a better day. Honor was a luxury for kingdoms that could afford it. In the Riverlands, survival came first. The small folk of the Trident learned this lesson too. They were farmers, not warriors. Their land was rich, but that richness made them targets. Every spring brought the promise of good harvests. Every summer brought armies that would burn those harvests. The Riverlands, peasants, learned to plant their crops and pray they would live to see the reaping. They learned to hide their daughters when the raiders came. They learned to bury their valuables and to never fight when they could run instead. And they learned that their lords could not always protect them. The Tullys did what they could. They sheltered refugees behind Riverrun's walls. They stored grain against lean times. They negotiated with conquerors to spare villages from the worst of the pillaging. But there was only so much any riverlord could do when kingdoms clashed and armies marched. The best a lord could hope for was to save some of his people. Not all, never all. This helplessness bred a particular kind of loyalty among the small folk. They did not love their lords the way the Northmen loved the Starks, or the Westermen followed the Lannisters. But they respected the Tullys. They knew their lords tried. They knew Riverrun's gates stayed open to those who needed shelter. They knew the Tullys paid the raiders tribute, so the villages would be spared. It was not the stuff of songs, but it mattered more than songs ever could. Centuries passed this way. The Iron Kings gave way to the Storm Kings, who pushed north and claimed the Riverlands for themselves. The Tullys bent the knee to them instead. Then the Storm Kings grew weak, and the Kings of the Reach moved north to fill the void. The Tullys bent the knee again. Through it all, Riverrun endured. The trout banner flew above its walls. The Tully words were spoken. Family, duty, honor. Those words meant something specific in the Riverlands. Family came first because you could not trust anyone else. Duty came second because survival required everyone to do their part. And honor came last, not because it mattered least, but because it was a luxury that could only be afforded after family and duty were secured. Other houses might mock such practicality. The Northmen might call it weakness. The Lords of the Vale might question the Tullys' courage. But the Tullys knew something those other houses did not. They knew what it meant to stand at the crossroads of Westeros. They knew what it cost to be the battlefield. And they knew that pride was a poor comfort when your castle was burning and your people were dying. So they endured, they adapted, they survived. But survival alone does not build a legacy. The Tullys remained what they had always been, riverlords of middling power, subordinate to whoever held the dominant kingdom. Valuable, but never great. They were stewards of an important castle, nothing more. Their ambitions were limited by the reality of their position. They could not dream of crowns. They could only dream of peace. The Ironborn returned again and again. Under King Harwin Hardhand, the Iron Islands rose to new heights of power. Harwin did not simply raid the Riverlands. He conquered them. He broke the armies of the Storm Kings and claimed the Trident as his own. The Riverlords found themselves under Ironborn rule once more, and this time the grip was tighter than ever before. Harwin's son and grandson continued his conquests. They built Harrenhal the mightiest castle ever raised in Westeros. It took 40 years to complete. Thousands of workers labored and died building those massive towers, and every stone was paid for with Riverlander sweat and gold. The Tullys paid their share. They sent their levies to work the quarries. They sent their taxes to fund the construction. They watched as Harren the Black, grandson of Harwin, built a monument to Ironborn dominance that would stand for 10,000 years. Or so Harren believed. By this time, the Tullys had endured centuries of foreign rule. They had bent the knee to Storm Kings and Reach Kings and Iron Kings. They had paid tribute and sent hostages and swallowed their pride. They had done everything required to keep Riverrun standing and their people alive. But they were still what they had always been, subordinate lords in a land that belonged to others. Harren the Black was the worst of all their overlords. He was cruel beyond measure. He demanded impossible tributes. He punished slowness with mutilation and death. He took the daughters of river lords as hostages and salt wives, and he ruled from Harrenhal, that massive fortress on the northern shore of the God's Eye, a constant reminder of iron-born power and Riverlander's subjugation. The river lords hated him, all of them. But what could they do? Harren commanded the largest army in Westeros. His castle could withstand any siege. His ironborn warriors were the fiercest fighters in the known world. To rebel was to die. So they bent the knee, and they waited, and they endured. In this, the Tullys were no different from any other river house. They had no special courage. They had no secret strength. They were simply one more family, trapped in the same impossible situation as all the others. If the story had ended there, they would have remained forever what they had always been, minor lords of a conquered land. But then the dragons came. Aegon Targaryen landed at the mouth of the Blackwater with a small army and 3 dragons. He declared himself king of all Westeros. He sent his messengers to every great house, demanding their submission. Most of those great houses laughed. A man with a few thousand soldiers and 3 winged beasts wanted to conquer an entire continent. It was madness. The great kings of Westeros had armies numbering in the tens of thousands. They had castles that had never fallen. They had bloodlines stretching back to the age of heroes. What they did not have were dragons. Harren the Black received Aegon's demand in Harrenhal. He read the message and burned it. His castle had walls 40 feet thick. No army could take it. No siege could starve it. Even dragons, Harren declared, could not harm him within his mighty walls. He would wait behind his impregnable defenses, and Aegon would break himself against Harrenhal's stones. The river lords watched and waited. They had seen conquerors before. They had seen kingdoms rise and fall. Perhaps this Aegon would win. Perhaps he would die. Either way, they would bend the knee to whoever emerged victorious. That was the way of the Riverlands. That was survival. But one lord saw something different. One lord recognized that this was not just another war between kingdoms. This was something new. Something that changed all the old calculations. One lord made a choice that would echo through the centuries. His name was Edmure Tully, Lord of Riverrun, and he bet everything on the dragons. The histories do not tell us much about Edmure Tully. We do not know if he was brave or cautious, wise or foolish, ambitious or simply desperate. We know only what he did, and what he did changed House Tully forever. When Aegon's host marched toward Harrenhal, Edmure Tully did not wait behind Riverrun's walls. He gathered his forces. He rode out to meet the Targaryen king, and he bent the knee to the Dragon Lord, offering him the support of House Tully and calling on all the other river lords to do the same. It was treason by every law Harren the Black recognized. It was a death sentence for Edmure and his entire house if Aegon lost, but it was also an opportunity. Perhaps the only opportunity the Tullys would ever have to become something more than subordinate river lords. Perhaps the only chance to free the Riverlands from the Ironborn yoke. Edmure Tully gambled everything on the dragons, and when Aegon Targaryen flew to Harrenhal on Balerion the Black-Dread and bathed the mighty castle in dragonfire, when Harren the Black and all his sons died screaming in the tallest tower of the fortress they believed impregnable, when the age of Ironborn rule over the Riverlands ended in a single night of fire and blood, that gamble paid off beyond anything Edmure could have dreamed. But that story belongs to the next chapter of House Tully's history. For now, we leave them at the moment of decision, at the precipice. One choice made in a moment of crisis that would elevate a minor river house to the highest ranks of Westerosi nobility. One gamble that would make the Tully's lords paramount of the Trident, rulers of all the Riverlands, peers to the greatest houses in the Seven Kingdoms. Everything was about to change. For House Tully, for the Riverlands, for Westeros itself. The age of dragons had begun, and the Trout Lords of Riverrun would rise with it. Harren the Black did not believe in dragons, or rather, he believed they existed, but he did not believe they could touch him. How could they? Harrenhal had walls 40 feet thick and towers that scraped the sky. It had taken 40 years to build, consuming the wealth of the Riverlands and the lives of thousands of workers. It was the mightiest fortress ever constructed in the history of Westeros. No army could breach its gates, no siege engines could crack its walls, and certainly no beasts, no matter how large or terrible, could harm a king sheltered within such impregnable stone. Harren was wrong. On the night Aegon Targaryen came to Harrenhal, the proud Iron King stood atop his tallest tower and watched the Dragon Lord approach. Perhaps he thought to intimidate Aegon with the sight of his massive fortress. Perhaps he believed the Targaryen would turn back when he saw the impossibility of taking such a castle. Perhaps he simply wanted to watch his enemy fail. Instead, Harren the Black watched his own doom arrive on black wings. Balerion the Black-Dread was the largest dragon that ever lived. When he spread his wings, his shadow could swallow entire towns. When he opened his jaws, the fires he breathed could melt stone and steel. Aegon rode upon his back that night, and together they flew above Harrenhal's mighty walls, as if those walls were nothing at all. Dragonfire poured down from the sky. It flowed through the windows of Harrenhal's towers like water through a sieve. Those 40-foot thick walls that Harren had trusted to protect him became his tomb. Stone does not burn, but everything inside stone does. The wooden floors and beams, the tapestries and furnishings, and the people, especially the people. Harren the Black and all his sons died that night, cooked alive in their own castle. Their screams echoed across the God's Eye as the towers of Harrenhal glowed red with heat. The Ironborn garrison tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The castle they had thought impregnable became a trap. By dawn, Harrenhal still stood, but House Hoare was extinct. The age of Ironborn rule over the Riverlands had ended in fire and ash, and Edmure Tully had chosen the winning side. The other river lords had watched and waited, as river lords always did. They had not committed to either side, waiting to see who would emerge victorious before bending their knees. It was the safe choice, the practical choice, the choice that had kept their houses alive through centuries of foreign rule. But Edmure Tully had not waited. He had ridden out to meet Aegon before the dragons flew. He had been the first to declare for the Targaryen king. And now, as the smoke rose from Harrenhal and the other river lords scrambled to pledge their fealty to the victor, Edmure stood at Aegon's side as the Dragon Lord accepted their submission. Aegon Targaryen was not a man who forgot loyalty, and he was not a man who forgave hesitation. The river lords had spent centuries under the boot of foreign kings. They had endured the Ironborn, suffered their cruelties, and paid their tributes. But when the moment came to choose freedom, only one house had shown the courage to act. Aegon's reward was swift and absolute. He named Edmure Tully Lord Paramount of the Trident, not just Lord of Riverrun, but overlord of all the Riverlands. Every river house, from the Blackwoods and Brackens to the Freys and Mallisters, would answer to House Tully. The Trout Lords, who had spent millennia as subordinates, were suddenly elevated to the highest rank of nobility, second only to the Iron Throne itself. It was everything Edmure could have hoped for, and more than he might have dared to dream. But it came with a price that would be paid over centuries. Because while Aegon had given House Tully dominion over the Riverlands, the other river lords had not forgotten who they used to be. The Brackens had been petty kings in the Age of Heroes. The Blackwoods claimed descent from the First Men and the old line of river kings. The Freys controlled the most important crossing in the Riverlands. The Mallisters held the coast and commanded fleets. These were proud houses with ancient lineages and their own claims to greatness. And now they were expected to bow to the Tullys, a house no greater than themselves until a Dragon Lord had chosen to elevate them. The resentment was immediate and deep. Edmure Tully understood this. He had lived in the Riverlands his entire life. He knew the pride of the River Lords and the long memories they kept. He knew that Aegon's decree could make him Lord Paramount, but it could not make the other houses respect him. That would have to be earned, and it would not be earned easily. So Edmure set about the work of building his authority. He did not do it with fire and blood, as the Targaryens might have. He did it the Tully way, with patience, practicality, and careful politics. First, he called the river lords to Riverrun, not to threaten them or to flaunt his new power, but to discuss how the Riverlands would be governed under the new order. He listened to their concerns. He acknowledged their ancient rights and privileges. He made it clear that he sought to be first among equals, not a tyrant lording over subjects. This was wise, but it was also necessary. The truth was that House Tully's power remained limited. They had a river run, certainly, a strong castle and valuable position. They had Aegon's favour, which was worth more than gold. But they did not have a significantly larger army than the other great river houses. They did not have vast wealth or legendary warriors. What they had was a title and a decree from a dragon king. That was enough to make them paramount, but it was not enough to make them secure. Edmure needed the other river lords to accept Tully rule, or at least to tolerate it. And so he offered them something they hadn't had in generations, stability. Under the Ironborn, the Riverlands had been a source of plunder and tribute. Under the Storm Kings and Reach Kings before them, it had been a frontier province, a buffer zone to be fought over and exploited. But under House Tully, Edmund promised, the Riverlands would be ruled by one of their own, a Riverlord who understood their needs and their struggles. It was not a perfect argument, but it was a good one, and slowly, grudgingly, the other houses began to bend. They bent their knees and swore their oaths, and they went home to their castles to grumble about the upstart Tullys. But they bent. The Freys were among the last to truly accept Tully authority. Lord Frey controlled the crossing, the twins' castles that commanded the only reliable bridge over the green fork of the Trident. Every army marching north or south had to pass through Frey lands and pay Frey tolls. It made House Frey rich and gave them a sense of importance that bordered on arrogance. They did not appreciate being subordinate to anyone, least of all the Tullys. But even the Freys bent eventually. Aegon had dragons, and Aegon had chosen the Tullys. That was the reality. And so the Freys swore their oaths and paid their homage, even as they schemed and plotted for ways to increase their own power at Tully expense. The Blackwoods and Brackens were another problem entirely. These two houses had been feuding since the Age of Heroes. Their hatred for each other was legendary, passed down through generations, renewed with every slight and every drop of blood spilled. Under the Ironborn, they had been kept in check by mutual fear of Harren's wrath. But now, Harren was dead, and the question became, who would stop them from tearing each other apart? That responsibility fell to House Tully. Edmund quickly learned that one of the most important duties of being Lord Paramount was not leading armies or collecting taxes. It was keeping the peace among his own bannermen. When the Blackwoods and Brackens went to war, as they did repeatedly, it was House Tully that had to intervene. It was House Tully that had to arbitrate disputes, enforce truces, and sometimes ride out with their own levies to separate the feuding houses by force. This was thankless work. Both houses resented Tully interference in what they considered their private quarrel. Both accused the Tullys of favouring the other side, and neither would ever truly forgive or forget the ancient grudges that drove their conflict. But it had to be done, because if the Riverlands descended into internal warfare, Aegon would have questions, and disappointing the Dragon Lord was not an option. So the Tullys learned to be mediators and peacekeepers. They learned to balance the competing interests of proud and fractious houses. They learned that authority meant responsibility, and that responsibility often meant making decisions that would please no one. Meanwhile, Edmund worked to strengthen Riverrun itself. The castle was already formidable, but it needed to be more than just defensible. It needed to be the obvious seat of power in the Riverlands. It needed to look like a castle worthy of a Lord Paramount. Stone was quarried, and walls were reinforced. The Watergate mechanism was improved, making it easier to flood the surrounding fields and turn Riverrun into an island. The Great Hall was expanded and decorated with fine tapestries. Meisters were brought in to establish a proper library. A sept was built for those who followed the Seven, though many Tullys still kept the old gods in their heart. All of this cost money. Money that had to be raised through taxes and tolls and fees. Money that the other river lords resented paying to their newly elevated overlord. But Edmure was careful about how he collected those revenues. He did not squeeze his bannermen dry. He took what was owed and no more. He spent the money on improvements that benefited all the Riverlands, not just House Tully. Roads were repaired, bridges were maintained, bandits were hunted down and hanged. Slowly, grudgingly, the Riverlands began to accept the new order. Edmure Tully ruled for many years after the conquest. He served Aegon the Conqueror faithfully and sent his levies whenever the Iron Throne called. When Aegon needed armies to put down rebellions or enforce his will, the River Lords marched under the Tully banner. This was part of the bargain. House Tully owed everything to the Targaryens, and they never forgot it. But Edmure also had to balance his loyalty to the Iron Throne with his responsibility to the Riverlands. When Aegon's demands were reasonable, Edmure complied eagerly. When they were excessive, Edmure negotiated. He learned to manage the expectations of both his king and his bannermen, to give each enough of what they wanted that neither would turn against him. It was exhausting work. Being Lord Paramount meant serving two masters, the Iron Throne above and the River Lords below. It meant constant vigilance, constant diplomacy, constant awareness that one misstep could destroy everything House Tully had gained. But Edmure had made the choice to bet on the dragons, and now he had to live with the consequences of that choice. When Edmure Tully finally died, he left behind a legacy that was still fragile but unmistakably real. House Tully was no longer just another river house. They were Lords Paramount of the Trident, and that title had begun to mean something. The other river lords might not love the Tullys, but they obeyed them. The small folk might not sing songs about Tully heroes, but they appreciated the peace and stability that Tully rule had brought. Most importantly, Edmure had established a principle that his descendants would follow for 3 centuries. House Tully's power depended on the Iron Throne. They had been elevated by a Targaryen king, and their continued authority required Targaryen support. This meant that the Tullys would always be among the most loyal vassals of the crown. They would support Targaryen kings in good times and bad. They would send their armies when called. They would never rebel, never waver, never question. Because to do so would be to risk losing everything. Edmure's son inherited Riverrun and the paramountcy, and he continued his father's work of consolidating Tully authority. Generation after generation, the Tullys held the Riverlands together through the long reign of the Targaryen dynasty. They were not the most powerful house in Westeros. They did not have the wealth of the Lannisters or the armies of the Reach or the ancient prestige of the Starks. But they had something almost as valuable. They had position. The Riverlands remained the heart of Westeros, and Riverrun remained the heart of the Riverlands. Every army marching to war passed through Tully territory. Every trade route connected through Tully lands. The Lords Paramount of the Trident could not be ignored or dismissed. They were essential to any king who hoped to rule the 7 kingdoms effectively. This centrality gave House Tully influence beyond their military strength. It gave them a seat at every important council. It gave them the ear of kings and the respect of lords. It made them valuable as allies and dangerous as enemies. But it also made them vulnerable, because when war came to Westeros, as it always did, the Riverlands became the battlefield, and House Tully, sitting at the crossroads of the continent, could never avoid being drawn into the conflict. The price of Edmure Tully's ambition was paid not by him, but by his descendants, by the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would bear the Tully name through centuries of warfare and strife, by the lords of Riverrun who would learn that being Lord Paramount meant being first to bleed when kingdoms clashed. But that, too, is a story for another chapter. For now, we leave House Tully at the height of their triumph, at the moment when everything changed, when a minor river house became a great house of Westeros, when the trout banner flew higher than it ever had before. Edmure Tully had gambled on the dragons and won. The question was whether his house could keep what he had gained, whether they could hold the Riverlands together through the storms that were coming, whether they could maintain their authority over proud and resentful bannermen, whether they could survive the consequences of being essential to the Iron Throne. 300 years would pass before the answer became clear. 300 years of struggle and sacrifice. 300 years of the Tullys trying to be worthy of the position Edmure had won for them. 300 years that would end in fire and blood, just as they had begun. But for now, House Tully had risen, and the Riverlands, for the first time in memory, were ruled by one of their own. 300 years is a long time, longer than most houses can maintain their power, longer than most dynasties can hold together. But for 3 centuries, House Tully endured as lords paramount of the Trident, holding the Riverlands together through wars and rebellions, through dragonfire and winter, through the slow collapse of the Targaryen dynasty and the bloody chaos that followed. They endured, but they did not thrive, because the Riverlands remained what they had always been, the battlefield of Westeros, and the Tullys remained what they had become, the house that stood at the center of every storm. The early generations after Edmure faced the task of turning a gift from a dragon king into something that would last. They built alliances through marriage. Tully daughters wed sons of great houses across Westeros. Tully sons took wives from the most powerful river families. These marriages were not love matches. They were political bonds, chains of loyalty meant to tie houses together and prevent rebellion. The strategy worked after a fashion. The great river houses remained bound to the Tullys through blood and oath, but those bonds were tested again and again, because peace never lasted long in the Riverlands. When the Dornish Wars erupted in the early years of Targaryen rule, the River Lords marched south under the Tully banner. They fought in the deserts and mountains of Dorne, bleeding for a king most of them had never seen, dying in a war that meant nothing to the Riverlands. Thousands went south. Fewer came back. But the Tullys had no choice except to answer when the Iron Throne called. That was the price of their paramountcy. When the Faith Militant rose against the Targaryens, challenging the dragons and their incestuous marriages, the Riverlands burned. The poor fellows and warrior sons found many supporters among the River Lords, especially those who followed the Seven devoutly. Villages rose in rebellion. Castles closed their gates against royal tax collectors. And House Tully, caught between their loyalty to the Iron Throne and the fury of their own people, had to choose which mattered more. They chose the Iron Throne. The Tullys led armies to crush the faithful rebels in their own lands. They hanged poor fellows by the hundreds. They burned septs that harbored warriors' sons. They did what had to be done to prove their loyalty, even as their own small folk cursed them for heretics and traitors to the gods. The faith-militant uprising scarred the Riverlands deeply. Brother fought brother. Lords turned against their own people. And when it was over, when the dragons had finally broken the faith and forced the High Septon to disband the military orders, the Riverlands were left devastated and divided. The Tullys had won, if it could be called winning. They had kept their position and proven their loyalty, but they had lost the love of many of their own people in the process. That was the pattern that would repeat through the centuries. War would come. The Tullys would choose sides based on which choice best preserved their power. They would lead the River Lords into battle. The Riverlands would burn. And when peace finally came, House Tully would still be standing, bloodied but unbroken, ready to rebuild and prepare for the next war. Through it all, the Tullys maintained their reputation for pragmatism. They were not the most honourable house in Westeros. The Starks held that distinction. They were not the richest or the strongest or the most feared, but they were reliable. They kept their oaths. They paid their debts. They did what needed to be done, even when it was ugly or cruel or thankless. This reliability made them valuable to the Iron Throne. Targaryen kings learned that they could count on the Tullys to support the crown in any crisis. When rebellions erupted, the River Lords would march under the Trout banner to put them down. When succession disputes threatened civil war, the Tullys would back the king's chosen heir. When dragons were needed in the field, Riverrun would provide provisions and soldiers to support them. But reliability had its costs. The other great houses of Westeros could sometimes play both sides, hedging their bets and waiting to see who would win before committing fully. The Tullys could not. Their entire position rested on Targaryen support, and so they had to back the Targaryens completely every single time. This meant that when the Targaryens made mistakes, the Tullys paid for them. The Dance of the Dragons proved this terrible truth in Blood and the Fire. When King Viserys I died and his succession was disputed, Westeros tore itself apart. Princess Rhaenyra claimed the throne as her father's chosen heir. Her half-brother Aegon claimed it as the eldest male. Both had dragons, both had armies, and both demanded that the great houses choose a side. For most houses, this was a difficult choice. Support the wrong claimant and face destruction. Support the right one and be rewarded. The smart play was to wait, to see which way the wind was blowing before committing. But the Tullys could not wait. The Riverlands sat at the centre of Westeros, and both sides needed to control them. Whoever held the Riverlands could move armies freely across the continent. Whoever lost the Riverlands faced enemies on every border. The Lord of Riverrun at that time had to make a choice that would determine his house's fate. He chose Rhaenyra. The histories do not tell us why. Perhaps he believed her claim was stronger. Perhaps he thought she would win. Perhaps he simply made the choice that seemed right and hoped for the best. It almost destroyed House Tully. The war that followed was the bloodiest Westeros had seen since Aegon's conquest. Dragons fought dragons in the sky while armies clashed below. The Riverlands became the main battlefield, as they always did. Armies marched back and forth across the Trident, burning and pillaging. Dragon fire fell from the sky, turning castles into charnel houses and villages into ash. The small folk fled into the forests and tried to survive while the great lords fought over crowns and thrones. House Tully led the River Lords for Rhaenyra's cause. They won victories and suffered defeats. They saw their bannermen die by the thousands. They watched dragons burn their lands. And in the end, after years of horror and slaughter, they were on the losing side. Aegon II emerged victorious, though poisoned and broken. Rhaenyra was dead, fed to a dragon before her young son's eyes. The Blacks had lost to the Greens, and House Tully had supported the Blacks. The Tullys survived only because Aegon II died soon after his victory, and because the realm was so exhausted by war that no one had the strength to punish every house that had chosen wrong. The young king who succeeded Aegon II, Rhaenyra's son Aegon III, needed unity more than he needed vengeance, so the Tullys bent the knee to him and were forgiven. But the cost was staggering. The Riverlands were devastated. Entire regions had been depopulated. Castles lay in ruins. Fields went unplanted because there was no one left alive to work them. Wolves and bandits roamed freely, preying on the survivors. It would take a generation for the Riverlands to recover, and some places never did. The Dance of the Dragons taught House Tully a lesson they would never forget. Even loyalty could not protect them from the consequences of Targaryen civil wars. They had chosen a side in good faith, fought bravely, and nearly been destroyed for it. The only reason they survived was luck. Pure luck. And luck was not something any wise lord relied on. Yet when the next great crisis came, House Tully had no choice but to choose sides again. The Blackfire rebellions began nearly a century after the Dance of the Dragons. Demon Blackfire, a legitimized bastard son of King Aegon IV, rose in rebellion against his true-born half-brother, King Daeron II. Daemon claimed the throne was rightfully his, and many lords agreed. He was a warrior, while Daeron was a bookish man. He looked like a true king, while Daeron looked weak. And he had the sword Blackfire, the Targaryen blade of kings. Once again, Westeros split in two. Once again, the great houses had to choose. Once again, House Tully faced a terrible decision. They chose Daeron. They chose the legitimate king over the charismatic rebel. They chose law over strength. And once again, the Riverlands became a battlefield. The Blackfire Rebellion ended at the Redgrass Field, where Demon Blackfire and his twin sons died fighting against Daeron's loyalist forces. The Tullys were on the winning side this time, but victory came at the usual cost. The Riverlords had lost thousands of men. The Riverlands had been ravaged by marching armies, and the peace that followed was fragile and temporary, because there would be more Blackfire rebellions, 4 more over the next 60 years. Each time, a new Blackfire pretender would rise, claiming the Iron Throne. Each time, lords would rally to their banner, and each time, House Tully would support the Targaryen kings on the Iron Throne, because that was what they always did. By the time the Blackfire rebellions finally ended, House Tully had become what Edmure had made them 3 centuries earlier, the most reliable vassals of the Iron Throne. Every Targaryen king knew that whatever happened, whatever crisis erupted, the Tullys would stand with the crown. That loyalty was worth more than gold, but it was also a chain. The Tullys could never be free to pursue their own interests. They could never play politics the way the Lannisters or Tyrells did, maneuvering for advantage and switching sides when convenient. They were bound to the Iron Throne completely, and that binding would eventually drag them down. Through all these wars and rebellions, The Tullys developed a particular approach to leadership. They were not inspiring war leaders like the Baratheons. They were not cunning schemers like the Lannisters. They were not ancient and honored like the Starks. What they were was steady, dependable, practical. A Tully lord could be counted on to do his duty, even when that duty was unpleasant. He would honor his oaths even when breaking them would be more profitable. He would put family first, duty second, and personal honor third. These were not the values that songs celebrated, but they were the values that kept a house alive for 300 years at the center of Westeros. The Tully words reflected this pragmatism perfectly. Family, duty, honor, in that order. Family came first, because without family, you had nothing. Your children, your brothers, your cousins, these were the people you could trust when everyone else betrayed you. Duty came second, because survival required everyone to do their part. The Lord had duties to his king and his bannermen. The bannermen had duties to their lord. The small folk had duties to all of them. Honor came last, not because it was unimportant, but because it was a luxury that could only be afforded after family and duty were secure. Other houses mocked this hierarchy. The Starks put honor first and suffered for it. The Lannisters put family first, but twisted duty and honor to serve their ambitions. The Tyrells put ambition before everything. Each house had its own values and its own way, but the Tully way kept them alive and powerful for 3 centuries, which was more than most houses could claim. By the time the Targaryen dynasty began to crumble, House Tully had seen it all. They had survived wars and rebellions. They had chosen sides and paid prices. They had lost sons and daughters to Targaryen causes. They had bled for the Iron Throne over and over again, and through it all, they had endured. The last great test of Tully loyalty came during Robert's rebellion. Lord Hoster Tully was an old man by then, but still sharp and still practical. When the Mad King Aerys II burned Lord Rickard Stark and his heir Brynden alive, when Jon Arryn raised his banners in rebellion, when Robert Baratheon claimed the throne, the realm once again split in 2. The Targaryens had ruled for 300 years. House Tully owed them everything. Loyalty demanded that the Tullys support King Aerys against the rebels. But Hoster Tully looked at the situation with cold, clear eyes. He saw that Aerys was mad, burning lords alive for no reason, threatening to burn entire cities. He saw that the rebellion was growing stronger while the Targaryen cause grew weaker. He saw that the Starks and Arryns and Baratheons might actually win, and he saw an opportunity. Hoster made a choice that broke 3 centuries of Tully tradition. He sided with the rebels against the Iron Throne. But he was still a Tully, and he did not make this choice out of honor or righteousness. He made it for advantage. He demanded a price for his support. His daughters would marry into the great rebel houses. Catelyn would wed Brandon Stark, heir to Winterfell. When Brandon died, she would wed his brother Eddard instead. Lysa would wed Jon Arryn, the Lord of the Vale. These marriages would bind the Tullys to the north and the Vale forever, securing alliances that would protect the Riverlands for generations. It was the most ambitious political move a Tully had made since Edmund bent the knee to Aegon the Conqueror. And like Edmund's choice, it was a gamble. If Robert lost, House Tully would be destroyed. But if Robert won, the Tullys would be tied by blood to the new king's closest allies. Robert won. The Battle of the Trident was fought in Tullylands, and there Robert Baratheon slew Prince Rhaegar Targaryen in the river's waters. The Targaryen dynasty fell. Robert took the Iron Throne, and House Tully's gamble paid off, or so it seemed. Hoster Tully had secured great marriages for his daughters. He had positioned House Tully well for the new regime. He had proven that the Tullys could be just as cunning and ambitious as any other great house. But those marriages came at a terrible cost. A cost that Hoster was willing to pay because duty demanded it. A cost that his daughters would bear for the rest of their lives. Lysa Tully had been pregnant with a child, not Jon Arryn's. Hoster forced her to abort it with moon tea, nearly killing her in the process. The abortion left her broken, barely able to bear children, traumatized by what her father had done to her. But Hoster did it anyway, because Jon Arryn would not marry damaged goods, and the alliance with the Vale was too important to lose. Family, duty, honor, in that order. Hoster put duty before his daughter's well-being. He did what he believed necessary to secure his house's position, and he lived with the consequences, watching his daughter suffer and knowing he had caused it. This was the Tully way. This was what 3 centuries of sitting at the center of Westeros had made them. Practical, ruthless when necessary, willing to sacrifice anything, even their own children, for the sake of duty and position. Hoster Tully had won his gamble. House Tully was now connected by marriage to the Lord of Winterfell and the Lord of the Vale. The Riverlands were secure. The position that Edmund had won 300 years earlier was stronger than ever. But the cost of that security was about to come due, because Hoster's grandchildren would be the ones to pay the ultimate price for his ambitions. The marriages he had arranged would drag House Tully into one final war, a war that would destroy everything the Tullys had built, a war that would end 3 centuries of Tully rule over the Riverlands in blood and betrayal. The stage was set, the pieces were in place, and the fall was coming, inevitable as winter. By the time King Robert Baratheon died, Lord Hoster Tully was an old man dying slowly in his bed at Riverrun. The sickness had been eating at him for years, turning a once vigorous lord into a wasted shadow. He spent his days in his chamber, tended by maesters who could ease his pain but could not cure him. He spoke of the past, sometimes clearly and sometimes not. He called for his daughters who were far away. He muttered about duty and family and the choices he had made. His son Edmure ruled Riverrun in all but name, but the authority was not yet fully his. Hoster still lived. Hoster was still Lord of Riverrun and Lord Paramount of the Trident. And so the Riverlords waited, as they had always waited, for one generation to pass and the next to take up the burden. They did not have to wait long for war to come. When King Robert died and the realm learned that his children were not his own, that they were bastards born of incest between Queen Cersei and her brother Jaime, everything fell apart. Eddard Stark, Hand of the King and Hoster's good son, tried to do the honorable thing. He tried to see justice done. He tried to protect Robert's true heirs and expose the Lannister deception. The Lannisters killed him for it. They arrested Ned Stark as a traitor. They executed him in front of the great sept of Baelor while his daughters watched. They declared his son Robb a rebel and sent armies north to crush him. And in doing so, they guaranteed that the Riverlands would burn once more, because Catelyn Stark was a Tully. Her children carried Tully blood, and the House Tully had not survived 3 centuries by abandoning family when family needed them most. But before the war even truly began, Catelyn made a choice that would help destroy her father's house. She arrested Tyrion Lannister at the Crossroads Inn, accusing him of trying to murder her son Bran. She took him prisoner and brought him to the Vale to face her sister's justice. It was an act of impulse, born of fear and anger, and a mother's desperate need to protect her children. It was also a catastrophic mistake. Tywin Lannister did not forgive insults to his house. When he learned that his son had been seized by a Tully woman, he sent his armies into the Riverlands like a hammer falling. He did not wait for declarations of war. He did not send ravens demanding explanations. He simply unleashed his dogs. Sir Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, led the first attacks. He crossed into the Riverlands with a force of mounted knights and men-at-arms, and he began to burn. Villages went up in flames. Small folk were slaughtered or scattered. Crops were destroyed. Animals were killed or taken. And the river lords, caught unprepared, could do nothing to stop it. The Lannisters were sending a message. They were showing the Riverlands what it cost to defy Casterly Rock. They were punishing every man, woman, and child who lived under the Tully banner for Catelyn's presumption in taking Tyrion prisoner. Edmure Tully called his banners. He sent ravens to every river lord, demanding they gather their forces and come to Riverrun. He knew war was coming, and he knew the Riverlands needed to be ready. But calling banners and assembling armies takes time. Time the small folk of the Riverlands did not have as Gregor Clegane and his men moved through their lands like a plague. Lord Hoster, dying in his bed, heard the reports and understood what was happening. The Riverlands were burning again, just as they had burned during the Dance of the Dragons, just as they had burned during the Blackfire rebellions, just as they always burned when great houses went to war. He had tried so hard to secure his house's position. He had married his daughters to powerful lords. He had made alliances that should have protected the Riverlands. And now, those very alliances were dragging his people into another war. The River Lords answered Edmure's call, but not all of them came quickly. Some held back, waiting to see how the situation would develop. Some questioned whether they should fight the Lannisters at all. Tywin Lannister was the richest lord in Westeros and commanded the largest army. The Tullys were asking them to make an enemy of Casterly Rock for the sake of a Stark woman who had made a foolish decision. But Edmure had no choice. Family, duty, honor. The words of House Tully demanded action. Catelyn was family. Defending the Riverlands was duty. An honor such as it was required that they not bow to Lannister aggression without resistance. So Edmure gathered what forces he could. He sent riders to harry the Lannister raiding parties. He ordered lords to defend their own territories. He prepared Riverrun for siege because he knew that eventually Tywin would come for the Tully seat itself. And come Tywin did. The Lion of Lannister crossed into the Riverlands with the main strength of the West behind him. 15,000 men, maybe more. Knights in gleaming armor and men-at-arms in crimson cloaks. Siege engines and supply trains. An army that could break any castle and burn any field. Tywin did not come to raid. He came to conquer. Edmure met him in the field. It was a brave choice, perhaps even a noble one. But it was also a foolish choice. Edmure Tully was not a great battle commander. He was a decent man, brave and honorable. But he had never led armies in serious warfare. He had never faced someone like Tywin Lannister, who had spent a lifetime crushing his enemies and who brought to war the same cold calculation he brought to everything else. The River Lords were smashed. The battle was not even close. Tywin's forces tore through the Tully host like a knife through cloth. Knights were cut down, foot soldiers broke and ran. The banners of a dozen river houses fell in the mud and blood. Edmure barely escaped with his life, fleeing back to Riverrun with the remnants of his army. Tywin followed. He surrounded Riverrun and settled in for a siege. His forces spread across the Riverlands, taking castles and burning any house that resisted. The Lannisters were methodical and brutal. They were teaching the Riverlands a lesson about the cost of defying the West. Inside Riverrun, Edmure faced the reality of his situation. He was besieged in his own castle. His father was dying. His army was broken. The Riverlands were being systematically destroyed, and there was nothing he could do about it. The situation seemed hopeless. House Tully had survived 3 centuries of warfare, but this might be the war that finally broke them. The Lannisters were too strong. The Tullys were too weak, and the other kingdoms were too busy with their own concerns to help. But then the young wolf came south. Robb Stark was only 15 years old when his father was executed. He was a boy thrust into lordship, forced to become a man and a leader in a matter of days. But he was also his father's son, and he had been trained since childhood to lead. When the Northern Lords called him to war, he answered. When they offered him an army, he took it. And when he marched south to rescue his father, he found instead that he had to avenge him. The North had not marched to war in generations. The Northern Lords were not soft Southern knights. They were hard men from a hard land, led by a boy who had something to prove. They came south with ice in their hearts and vengeance on their minds, and they came to save the Riverlands. Robb's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He could not break the siege of Riverrun by marching directly at Tywin's army. The Lannisters were too strong and too well positioned, so instead, Robb split his forces. He sent a large portion of his army under the command of Roose Bolton to engage Tywin and keep him pinned at Riverrun. Then he took the rest of his men and marched west, toward the heart of Lannister power. Tywin took the bait. He left the siege of Riverrun and marched east to face what he thought was the main northern army. The two forces met in battle, and Tywin won. He smashed through Bolton's forces and drove them back. It was exactly the kind of victory Tywin Lannister expected. He had defeated another enemy in the field. But while Tywin was winning his battle in the east, Robb Stark was winning the war in the west. The young wolf had taken his cavalry and marched through the hills. He fell upon the Lannister forces besieging Riverrun like a thunderbolt. Jaime Lannister, who commanded the siege, was caught completely by surprise. The battle that followed was a slaughter. The Lannister forces were scattered and broken. Thousands were killed or captured, and Jaime Lannister himself, the Kingslayer, the greatest knight in the Seven Kingdoms, was taken prisoner by a boy of 15. Riverrun was freed. The siege was broken. And suddenly, impossibly, House Tully had hope again. Robb Stark entered Riverrun as a liberator and a hero. The Riverlords, who had doubted whether they should fight for the Tullys, now saw what Northern steel could accomplish. The small folk who had suffered under Lannister raids now had a champion. And Edmure Tully, who had been besieged and beaten, now stood beside the young wolf as an ally and a friend. The River Lords gathered at Riverrun to decide what came next. They had been freed from the Lannisters, but the war was far from over. The question was, what were they fighting for? Robb Stark had marched south to save his father and his sisters, but Ned Stark was dead. Sansa was a hostage in King's Landing. Arya was missing, presumed dead. The mission had failed before it could even begin. So what now? Should Robb bend the knee to King Joffrey and hope for mercy? Should he continue the war against the Lannisters? Should he try to make peace? The River Lords had their own concerns. They were trapped between the Lannisters to the west and the Crown to the south. They had been invaded and devastated. Their people were suffering. They needed protection and they needed leadership. The question was, who would provide it? The answer came not from the lords, but from the soldiers, the common men who had fought beside Robb Stark and seen what he could do. They began to whisper a dangerous idea, an idea that grew louder and bolder until it could not be ignored. Why should the North bow to a southern king? Why should the Riverlands serve masters in King's Landing who had never protected them? Why not make their own king? Why not crown the young wolf and let him lead them to victory? In the great hall of Riverrun, with Lord Hoster dying upstairs and the sounds of celebration echoing through the castle, the lords of the North and the Riverlands made a choice that would seal all their fates. They proclaimed Robb Stark king in the North, not a rebel fighting for the Iron Throne, not a lord seeking to put another man in power, but a king in his own right. And then Lord Jonos Bracken went further. He declared Robb Stark king of the Trident as well. The Riverlands would join the North in independence. They would break free from the Iron Throne and the Lannisters and all the southern kingdoms that had used them as a battlefield for centuries. They would have their own king, one who had already proven he could protect them. One by one, the River Lords bent the knee to Robb Stark. Edmure Tully was among the first. He knelt before the boy who had saved his castle and his people, and he swore his oaths. The words echoed through the hall as lord after lord followed his example. The Mallisters and the Vances, the Pipers and the Darrys, even the Frys, though Lord Walder's oath came through his son and was notably half-hearted. In that moment, House Tully made the most momentous choice since Edmund had bent the knee to Aegon the Conqueror. They broke their oaths to the Iron Throne. They declared independence. They crowned a Stark as their king. It was the complete reversal of everything the Tullys had been for 300 years. They were no longer the most loyal vassals of the crown. They were rebels, traitors, enemies of the realm. It should have felt like liberation. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump. Robb Stark accepted the crown and the oaths. He was king in the North and king of the Trident now. He commanded 2 kingdoms and their combined armies. He held Jaime Lannister prisoner. He had won every battle he had fought. Victory seemed not just possible, but likely. But the experienced lords knew better. They knew that wars were not won by crowning kings in great halls. They knew that the Lannisters would never accept this rebellion. They knew that the other kingdoms would not simply let the northern Riverlands break away. They knew that the real war was just beginning, and they knew that the Riverlands, as always, would bear the worst of it. Because geography had not changed. The Riverlands still sat at the center of Westeros, There was still the crossroads where armies met. There was still the battlefield where kingdoms fought their wars. Crowning Robb Stark king did not change that fundamental reality. If anything, it made things worse. Edmure Tully looked at his nephew, this boy king with ice-grey eyes and his father's honor, and he hoped desperately that they had made the right choice. He hoped that Robb could finish what he had started. He hoped that victory was possible. But deep down, in a place he did not let himself examine too closely, Edmure knew the truth. The Riverlands were burning again, just as they always had, just as they always would. And this time, there might be no coming back. The war was only beginning. The worst was still to come. And House Tully, which had endured for 3 centuries through every storm, was about to face the greatest test of all. For a time, it seemed like the impossible might actually happen. The young wolf was winning. Robb Stark, king in the north and king of the Trident, led his armies to victory after victory. He outmaneuvered Tywin Lannister. He captured castles. He freed the Riverlands from Lannister occupation. Every battle he fought, he won. The Northern and River Lords began to believe that they had chosen the right king, that maybe, just maybe, they could actually win their independence. But wars are not won by battles alone. They are won by alliances and logistics, by keeping your army fed and your lords loyal, by making the right choices at the right times. And in these less glorious aspects of warfare, the cracks in Robb's kingdom began to show. Lord Hoster Tully finally died in his bed at Riverrun. He had held on long enough to see his grandson crowned king, long enough to know that his daughter's son had saved the Riverlands from the Lannisters. But he did not live long enough to see how it would all end. Perhaps that was a mercy. His death was not unexpected. He had been dying for years, but it still hurt. Edmure had lost his father. Catelyn had lost the man who had shaped her entire life, for better and worse. And the Riverlands had lost the lord who had ruled them for decades, who had married his daughters to secure alliances, who had chosen Robert over Aerys and changed the course of history. The funeral was held at Riverrun, in the way of the River Lords. Hoster's body was placed in a boat and set upon the water, an arrow meant to light the funeral pyre as it floated downstream. It should have been simple. It should have been dignified. But Edmure, standing on the bank with his bow, could not make the shot. 3 times he fired. 3 times he missed. His father's body floated past, unburned, a corpse on a boat drifting toward the sea. Finally, the Blackfish stepped forward. Brynden Tully, Hoster's brother, the greatest archer among them. He took the bow, drew, and fired. The arrow flew true. The boat burst into flames. Hoster Tully went to his rest in fire and smoke, as river lords had for thousands of years. It was a small thing, that missed shot, a moment of human failure at a time of grief. But it said something about Edmure Tully. He was a good man. He was brave. He cared about his people and his duty. But he was not his father. He did not have Hoster's cunning or his ruthless practicality. He had heart, but heart alone does not win wars. Edmure was now Lord of Riverrun and Lord Paramount of the Trident in truth. The River Lords were his to command, but he commanded them in service to King Robb, and Robb was fighting a war on multiple fronts against multiple enemies. The Lannisters to the west and south, the Baratheons at Storm's End and Dragonstone, the Greyjoys who had betrayed their old alliance and invaded the north while Robb was south, the Iron Throne itself, backed by the wealth of Highgarden, The odds were terrible, but Robb kept winning. He took the crag, a small castle in the west. He harried Lannister's supply lines. He kept his army together and his lords loyal. He was everything a king should be: brave, honorable, clever in battle, loved by his men. But he was also young, and youth makes mistakes that age would avoid. At the crag, Robb was wounded. Not seriously, but enough that he needed tending. A girl named Jane Westerling nursed him. She was beautiful and kind, and Robb was far from home and grieving his father. What happened next was predictable. Robb slept with Jane. He took her maidenhead. And then, because he was Ned Stark's son and could not live with the dishonor of ruining a girl and abandoning her, he married her. It seemed like the honorable choice. It seemed like what his father would have done. But it was the worst mistake Robb Stark ever made, because Robb was already promised to another. He had made a pact with Lord Walder Frey, promising to marry one of Walder's daughters in exchange for the Frey's support and passage across the Twins. That pact was the foundation of the alliance between the Starks and the Freys. Breaking it meant breaking the alliance, and the Freys did not forgive broken promises. When word reached the Twins that Robb had married someone else, Lord Walder was furious. His daughters had been insulted. His house had been dishonored. The young wolf had shown him disrespect, treating the Freys as unimportant, as if their support did not matter. Walder Frey had spent his entire long life being disrespected by greater lords. He had endured it because he had no choice. But this was different. This time, he had leverage. This time, he could make them pay. The Freys withdrew from Robb's host. Thousands of men marched home to the Twins, leaving Robb's army weaker. The other river lords grumbled. They had bent the knee to Robb Stark. They had declared him king. They had fought his battles and bled for his cause. And now, he had thrown away a crucial alliance because he could not keep his breeches laced. It was the kind of foolishness that got good men killed. Catelyn tried to fix the situation. She went to Walder Frey and negotiated a new bargain. Robb could not marry a Frey daughter now. That ship had sailed, but Edmure could. Edmure was unwed and needed a wife anyway. He was Lord of Riverrun, a prize nearly as valuable as a king. Let Edmure marry one of Walder's daughters, and the alliance could be restored. Walder agreed, though his anger still simmered beneath the surface. The wedding would be held at the Twins. Edmure would marry Rosalind Frey, one of Walder's many daughters. The Starks and Tullys would attend to show good faith and to heal the breach. It would be a celebration, a moment of unity before the war continued. Edmure did not want this marriage. He barely knew Rosalind Frey. He had not chosen her. He was being sacrificed on the altar of political necessity, married off to repair his nephew's mistake. But he was a Tully, and Tullys understood duty. His father had forced Lacer to abort a child and marry Jon Arryn for the sake of alliance. Compared to that, an arranged marriage was a small price to pay. So Edmure agreed. He would do his duty. He would marry a Frey and make peace. But before the wedding, the war took another turn. Robb had a plan to win the West. He would march his army toward Casterly Rock itself, the heart of Lannister power. If he could threaten Tywin's home, the Lion would have to respond. Tywin would have to pull his forces away from the Riverlands and return west to defend his seat. This would give Robb the chance to fight Tywin on ground of his own choosing, away from the Lannister allies in the south. The plan required holding a key crossing on the Red Fork. Tywin would try to cross the river to return west, and Robb wanted to let him. Let Tywin cross, let him march away, and then strike at his rear when he was stretched out on the march. It was a good plan, the kind of clever strategy that had won Robb his other victories. But Edmure did not know the full plan. Robb had not told him. Perhaps he thought Edmure did not need to know. Perhaps he did not trust his uncle with the details. Either way, Edmure was left at Riverrun with orders to hold the crossing and defend his lands. He was not told to let Tywin pass. He was told to hold. So when Tywin Lannister came to the Red Fork with his army, Edmure did exactly what he thought he was supposed to do. He gathered every man he could. He fortified every ford. And when Tywin tried to cross, Edmure stopped him. The battle raged along the river for days. The Lannisters tried to force their way across again and again. And again and again, Edmure's forces threw them back. It was a victory. A genuine, hard-fought victory. Edmure had defeated Tywin Lannister in the field. He had held the river. He had protected his lands. His men cheered him. The small folk praised him. He had done his duty and won glory doing it. But he had also ruined Robb's plan. Tywin could not cross the river going west, so he went south instead. He marched to King's Landing, arriving just in time to join forces with the Tyrells and smash Stannis Baratheon at the Battle of the Blackwater. The battle that should have seen Stannis take the capital and overthrow the Lannisters, instead saw Stannis defeated and the Lannister hold on the throne secured. Tywin and the Tyrells formed an alliance that made them unstoppable, and Robb's chance to threaten Casterly Rock and draw Tywin west was lost. When Robb learned what Edmure had done, he was furious. He berated his uncle in front of the other lords. He explained the plan that Edmure had ruined. He made it clear that Edmure's victory had cost them the war. Edmure was devastated. He had done what he thought was right. He had defended his lands and won a battle. But in doing so, he had destroyed the larger strategy. He had acted on incomplete information and made the situation worse. It was the kind of mistake that could not be undone. The war was going badly now. Stannis was defeated. The Lannisters and Tyrells were allied. The Greyjoys held much of the north. Robb's kingdom was being squeezed from all sides. The River Lords began to whisper that maybe they had chosen wrong. Maybe they should have stayed loyal to the Iron Throne. Maybe crowning a boy king had been a mistake. Robb needed to restore the Frey alliance. He needed those men back in his army. And so, he went to the twins for Edmure's wedding. He brought his mother and his pregnant wife. He brought his most trusted lords and his best soldiers. He came in peace, under guest right, to celebrate a wedding and to make amends. Walder Frey welcomed them. He threw a feast in the great hall of the twins. There was music and food and wine. Edmure married Roslyn, who turned out to be beautiful and kind. For a moment, it seemed like things might work out after all. The alliance would be restored. The Freys would return to Robb's service. The war could continue. Then the music changed. The musicians put down their instruments and drew weapons. The doors to the hall were barred, and the massacre began. The Red Wedding was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The Stark and Tully forces were attacked without warning. They were unarmed, drunk, unprepared. The Freys and their allies cut them down where they sat. Men died with cups in their hands and songs on their lips. They died calling for help that would not come. They died betrayed by the guest right that should have protected them. Robb tried to fight. He was wounded multiple times, arrows in his back and his chest, but he kept moving. He tried to reach his mother. He tried to protect his wife, but there were too many enemies and too few friends. He was a king, but in that moment, he was just a boy, dying far from home, betrayed by men he thought he could trust. Catelyn Stark watched her son die. She had already lost her husband to Lannister treachery. She had lost her daughters, one a hostage and one missing. And now she watched Robb, her firstborn, her boy king, murdered at a wedding feast. In her desperation, she grabbed Walder Frey's wife and held a knife to her throat. She begged for her son's life. She promised anything, everything, if they would just spare Robb. Walder Frey laughed. He did not care about his wife. He had many wives. He had many children. One more or less meant nothing to him, and Robb Stark was worth more dead than alive. Roose Bolton, one of Robb's own bannermen, stepped forward and drove a knife into Robb's heart. He said words that would echo through the Riverlands forever. The Lannisters send their regards. Robb Stark died in his mother's arms. Catelyn, her mind broken by grief, killed Walder Frey's wife and then died herself, her throat cut by a Frey man-at-arms. Their bodies were desecrated. Robb's head was cut off and replaced with the head of his direwolf. Catelyn's naked body was thrown into the river. The king in the north and the Lady of Winterfell ended not in glory, but in horror. Outside, the Frey and Bolton forces attacked the Stark and Tully camp. They slaughtered men in their tents. They killed them as they slept, or stumbled awake confused and afraid. Thousands died that night. Good men, loyal men, men who had followed their king in good faith and been murdered for it. Edmure Tully survived. He survived because he was valuable. He was Lord of Riverrun. He was the key to controlling the Riverlands. So the Freys took him prisoner. They locked him in a cell and kept him alive as a hostage, a tool to be used against his own people. The Blackfish escaped. Brynden Tully was old, but not foolish. He had not trusted the Freys. When the killing started, he was outside the castle, seeing to his horse or making water. He slipped away in the chaos and rode hard for Riverrun. He would not surrender. He would not bend the knee, and he would make the Freys pay for what they had done. But he was one man. One old knight, no matter how skilled, could not change what had happened. The Red Wedding had destroyed the Northern cause. Robb Stark was dead. His army was shattered. His lords were dead or scattered. The Kingdom of the North and the Trident died in a single night, drowned in blood and treachery. The Riverlands, which had declared independence and crowned a Stark as king, now lay broken and leaderless. The Freys claimed that they had acted on orders from the Iron Throne, that this had been justice against rebels. The Lannisters rewarded them with lands and titles. The River Lords, who had bent the knee to Robb, now found themselves on the losing side of a war that had ended in the worst way possible. House Tully, which had endured for 3 centuries, was shattered. Hoster was dead. Catelyn was dead. Lysa was in the Vale, mad and useless. Edmure was a prisoner. Brynden was an outlaw. And Riverrun, the castle that had stood for thousands of years, was alone and surrounded by enemies. The fall had come, not slowly, not through years of decline, but in one terrible night, one wedding, one betrayal, one act of monstrous cruelty that violated every law of gods and men. The Red Wedding broke House Tully as surely as it broke the Northern cause, and the Riverlands, which had suffered through so many wars, faced the worst aftermath yet. Because the war was over, The rebellion had failed. And now came the occupation. Now came the revenge. Now came the long, dark years when the Riverlands would learn what it meant to be on the losing side of a war against the Lannisters and their allies. The trout banner still flew over Riverrun. The Blackfish still held the castle. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The end had come for House Tully. 300 years of power and pride and endurance had led to this. Bodies in a river, a king murdered at his uncle's wedding, and a house broken beyond repair. The worst was over. But somehow, that made what came next even harder to bear. The news of the Red Wedding spread across the Riverlands like poison in the water. At first, many refused to believe it. Kings did not die at weddings. Guest right was sacred. No lord, no matter how ruthless, would violate the oldest laws of gods and men. But the refugees told the truth in their terror. The survivors carried the story in their wounds. And slowly, horribly, the Riverlands understood what had happened. Robb Stark was dead. The Northern Army was destroyed. The rebellion was over. And House Frey, along with their Bolton allies, had delivered the killing blow. The reaction was not what the Freys expected. They thought the Riverlands would accept the new reality. They thought the River Lords would bend the knee to the Iron Throne and be grateful the war was over. They thought pragmatism would win out over sentiment, as it always had before. They were wrong. The Red Wedding did not end resistance in the Riverlands. It ignited it. Because what the Freys had done was not just murder. It was a violation of everything the Riverlands held sacred. Guest right was the foundation of civilization in Westeros. It was the promise that made peace possible. When you ate a man's bread and salt, you were safe under his roof. That was the law. That was the covenant. And the Freys had broken it. The River Lords might have bent the knee to a victorious Lannister army. They might have accepted defeat with the same pragmatism that had kept them alive for centuries. But they would not forgive what the Freys had done. They would not accept the men who had murdered a king at a wedding as their new overlords. So when the Freys tried to assert control over the Riverlands, they met resistance. Not open rebellion. The River Lords were not foolish enough to march armies against the combined might of the Freys, Boltons, and Lannisters, but quiet resistance, stubborn resistance, the kind that wore down occupiers and made rule impossible. Villages refused to provide the Freys with supplies. Lords delayed answering summons. Roads became dangerous for Frey patrols. Bridges collapsed at convenient times, and men began to disappear. Frey soldiers sent out on patrol would not return. Frey tax collectors would be found hanging from trees. It was not war. It was murder, cold and deliberate, carried out by people who would never forgive what had been done. The Brotherhood without banners became the voice of this resistance. They had been fighting the Lannisters since the beginning of the war, operating in the wilderness, protecting small folk and harrying enemy forces. Now they had a new purpose. They hunted Freys. They executed collaborators. They gave the Riverlands hope that someone was still fighting. And they had a new leader. A leader who had died once, but came back wrong. Catelyn Stark's body had been thrown in the Green Fork after the Red Wedding. She drifted downstream, dead and rotting, until the Brotherhood found her days later. They should have buried her. They should have given her the peace she deserved. But one of their number, a red priest named Thoros, had the power to bring back the dead. He had done it before, for his friend Beric Dondarrion, and so he tried it again, with Catelyn. It worked, but what came back was not the woman who had died. It was something else, something filled with rage and hatred and an overwhelming need for vengeance. The small folk called her Lady Stoneheart, and they were right to fear her. She led the Brotherhood now, and under her command, they became something darker than they had been. They still protected the innocent, but they also killed, without mercy, anyone associated with the Red Wedding. Freys especially, but also Boltons and Lannisters, and anyone who had collaborated with them. Lady Stoneheart could not speak easily. Her throat had been cut at the twins and never properly healed. But she could point, she could judge, and she could condemn. And the men of the Brotherhood, who had loved Catelyn Stark and mourned her death, followed her commands without question. They hanged Freys from every tree they could find. They left them dangling as warnings to others. They made the Riverlands a place of terror for anyone who had betrayed Robb Stark. This resistance terrified the occupiers, but it also made life harder for the small folk, because the Freys and Lannisters responded to attacks with reprisals. When a Frey patrol was ambushed, they burned the nearest village. When a tax collector was killed, they hanged 10 peasants. The Riverlands were already devastated by years of war. Now they suffered under occupation and resistance simultaneously, caught between the vengeance of Lady Stoneheart and the brutality of House Frey. Meanwhile, Riverrun still held. The Blackfish had made it back to the castle after the Red Wedding. He had gathered the survivors. He had closed the gates, and he had refused every demand to surrender. Brynden Tully was 70 years old, but he was still the best knight in the Riverlands and the most stubborn man alive. He would not bend the knee to the Freys. He would not surrender his family's castle to the men who had murdered his great-nephew. He would hold Riverrun until death took him or the castle fell. The Freys besieged Riverrun, but they could not take it. The castle's defences were too strong. The Watergate allowed the garrison to flood the approaches and turn Riverrun into an island. The Tullys had food and water. They had walls that had never been breached. They had the advantage, and the Blackfish knew how to use it. Months passed. The siege continued. The Freys tried assaults and were thrown back. They tried blockades, and Riverrun did not starve. They tried negotiations, and the Blackfish laughed at them. The situation was an embarrassment to the crown. Riverrun was the last major holdout in the Riverlands, and as long as it stood, it proved that resistance was possible. The Lannisters decided to end it. They sent Jaime Lannister, now freed from captivity, to take command of the siege. Jaime had lost his sword hand to a Bolton man during his captivity. He was no longer the greatest knight in Westeros, but he was still clever, and he still bore the Lannister name. He came to Riverrun with a larger army and a hostage that might break the deadlock. That hostage was Edmure Tully. Edmure had been a prisoner since the Red Wedding. He had spent months in a cell, learning what his naivety and his uncle's wedding had cost. His king was dead. His sister was dead. His people were suffering under occupation, and he was alive only because the Freys and Lannisters thought he might be useful. Now they would test that theory. Jaime brought Edmure to Riverrun. He made him a simple offer. Edmure could order the Blackfish to surrender the castle. He was Lord of Riverrun. The garrison would have to obey him. If he gave the command, the castle would open its gates without a fight. In exchange, Edmure would be allowed to live. He would be sent to Casterly Rock as a hostage, but he would be treated well. His wife Roslyn was pregnant with his child. He could see his son or daughter born. He could have a life, such as it was. If he refused, Jaime would have no choice but to assault the castle. Many men would die, and after Riverrun fell, as it eventually would, Edmure would be hanged from the walls as a traitor. It was not much of a choice, but Jaime presented it with something like compassion. He was not proud of the Red Wedding. He had not been part of it. He was a Lannister, and he served his house. But even he found what the Freys had done distasteful. So he offered Edmure a way out, a way to save his own life and the lives of the garrison, a way to end the bloodshed. The Blackfish told Edmure to refuse. He said they should fight. They should hold Riverrun until the Lannisters gave up or until help came. He said that surrendering now would mean everything they had fought for was lost. Better to die free than to live as Lannister prisoners. But Edmure was not the Blackfish. He was not a warrior. He was not a hero from the songs. He was a lord who had tried to do his duty and watched everything fall apart around him. He was a husband who wanted to see his child. He was a man who had spent months in a cell, wondering if death would come before morning. And he was tired, so tired of war and death and suffering. Edmure made his choice. He agreed to Jaime's terms. He would command the Blackfish to surrender Riverrun. But the Blackfish refused. He called Edmure a traitor and a coward. He said he would not surrender to Lannisters and Freys no matter who gave the command. He said he would rather die fighting than live in shame. And then, as the gates opened and the Lannister forces entered Riverrun, the Blackfish disappeared. Some say he escaped through the Watergate, swimming the river in the dark and vanishing into the wilderness. Some say he died fighting in the keep, killed by Lannister men who hid his body to avoid making him a martyr. The truth is lost, but the Blackfish was gone, and with him went the last armed resistance of House Tully. Riverrun fell without a battle. The garrison surrendered. The Lannister banners were raised over the castle that had flown the Tully trout for thousands of years, and Edmure Tully was taken west as a prisoner to live out his days in Casterly Rock, a hostage to ensure the Riverlands' good behavior. The Freys were given Riverrun as their reward for the Red Wedding. Emmon Frey, who had married Jenna Lannister and was thus connected to both houses, was named Lord of Riverrun. The castle that had been the seat of House Tully for as long as anyone could remember now belonged to the house that had murdered their king. It was a final insult, a final humiliation for House Tully. But naming a Frey Lord of Riverrun did not make him lord in truth. The castle's garrison obeyed because they had no choice. The small folk bowed because soldiers forced them to, but no one accepted Frey rule. No one forgot what had happened. No one forgave. The Riverlands settled into a bitter peace. The war was over. The rebellion had failed. The Starks were destroyed. The Tullys were scattered and broken. The Iron Throne and his Lannister and Frey allies controlled the territory, if not the hearts of the people. But control was not peace. The Riverlands remained dangerous. The Brotherhood, without banners, still operated in the wilderness. Lady Stoneheart still hunted Freys. Bandits and outlaws roamed freely, taking advantage of the chaos. And the small folk, who had suffered through years of war and now suffered under occupation, grew harder and more desperate with each passing season. The Freys tried to establish authority. They sent soldiers to garrison castles. They appointed loyal men to important positions. They collected taxes and enforced laws. But they could not make the Riverlands love them. They could not make the river lords respect them. They could barely make the roads safe for travel. Edmure Tully sat in Riverrun's great hall and called himself Lord of Riverrun. But he knew the truth. He held the castle only because Lannister swords kept him there. The moment those swords were withdrawn, his rule would end. He was hated by his own people, hated by the very lords he was supposed to command, and he knew that hate would eventually find a way to express itself. The other river lords bent the knee because they had no choice. They swore oaths to the Iron Throne. They paid their taxes. They attended court when summoned. But they did so grudgingly, and they looked for any opportunity to undermine the new order. Some supported the Brotherhood quietly. Some sheltered outlaws. Some simply waited for the situation to change, as it always did in the Riverlands. The cost of the war was visible everywhere. Entire villages had been destroyed and never rebuilt. Fields lay fallow because there was no one left to work them. Castles were held by skeleton garrisons. The population had been decimated by years of fighting, by disease and famine that followed armies, by the systematic brutality of occupying forces. The Riverlands had been wealthy once, the breadbasket of Westeros. Now they were broken and bleeding, a wasteland of shattered dreams and burned homes. And House Tully, which had ruled these lands for 3 centuries, was finished. Edmure was a prisoner. The Blackfish was dead or vanished. Catelyn was gone, transformed into a monster of vengeance. Lysa was in the Vale, mad and isolated, and would soon be dead as well. The trout banners were torn down and burned. The words family, duty, honor rang hollow in a world where family was slaughtered at weddings. Duty meant nothing to men like Walder Frey, and honor died with Robb Stark. The great houses had fallen before. The gardeners had been burned at the field of fire. The Hoares had died in Harrenhal. The Reynes and Tarbecks had been destroyed by Tywin Lannister. But those houses had fallen in battle, defeated by enemies in open warfare. House Tully fell to treachery. They fell to a violated guest right. They fell to the worst impulses of men who valued power over honor. And they fell knowing that no one would save them. No one would avenge them. The Iron Throne was in Lannister hands. The Starks were destroyed. The Vale was isolated. The rest of Westeros had its own problems. The Riverlands were alone, and House Tully was broken beyond repair. Or so it seemed. Because in the darkest moments, when everything appears lost, sometimes the smallest spark of hope remains. A spark that might grow into a flame. A spark that carries the Tully name and the Tully blood, even if she does not yet know how to use it. But that is a question for the future. For now, the fall was complete. House Tully had risen with the dragons and fallen with the wolves. 300 years of power ended in a handful of months. The Trout Lords were no more, and the Riverlands wept for what they had lost. When we look back at the history of House Tully, we see a story that is uniquely tragic, even by the standards of Westeros. Other great houses have fallen, certainly, but most fell fighting. Most fell with swords in their hands and defiance on their lips. House Tully fell differently. They fell to treachery. They fell to broken oaths and violated hospitality. They fell not because they were weak, but because they trusted the wrong people. at the wrong time. The current state of House Tully is grim. Let us account for what remains. Edmure Tully, Lord of Riverrun and Lord Paramount of the Trident in name, sits in a comfortable cell in Casterly Rock. He is a hostage, kept alive to ensure the Riverlands remain pacified. He has been allowed to see his wife Roslyn and their son, born in captivity. The boy carries the Tully name, but he will grow up a prisoner, raised far from Riverrun, far from the lands his father should rule. Edmure himself grows older in captivity, watching the years pass, knowing his people suffer under Frey rule while he can do nothing to help them. He is not tortured, he is not abused, but he is broken in a way that no torture could accomplish. He is a lord without lands, a father raising a son who will never know freedom, a man who made one choice to save lives and lost everything because of it. Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, is gone. Whether he died at Riverrun or escaped into the wilderness, no one knows for certain. If he lives, he is an old man now, alone and hunted, the last free Tully in the Riverlands. If he died as he lived, defiant to the end, refusing to bend knee to those who had wronged his house. Either way, the Blackfish cannot restore House Tully. He is one man, and one man cannot rebuild what was destroyed at the Red Wedding. Lysa Tully, Arryn is dead. She was thrown from the moon door in the Vale by Pater Baelish, the man she loved and trusted. Her son Robin is Lord of the Vale now, but he is weak and sickly, controlled by Littlefinger. He carries Tully blood through his mother, but he is an Arryn. He will not save the Riverlands. He can barely manage the Vale. Catelyn Stark, born Catelyn Tully, is also dead, but death did not end her story. She walks the Riverlands as Lady Stoneheart, leading the Brotherhood without banners in a campaign of vengeance against the Freys and anyone associated with the Red Wedding. She is not the woman she was. She cannot speak easily. She does not feel mercy or compassion. She is rage-given form, a ghost seeking revenge for crimes that can never be undone. She kills Freys without trial or hesitation. She hangs them from trees and leaves them for the crows. She is terror and justice mixed together, and the small folk do not know whether to fear her or pray to her. Lady Stoneheart cannot restore House Tully either. She is not interested in ruling. She is not interested in rebuilding. She wants only one thing, to make the people who destroyed her family suffer. And when she has killed every Frey she can find, when she has avenged Rob's death as completely as possible, what then? Will she find peace? Will she finally rest? Or will she continue hunting until someone puts her down like the monster she has become? These are the remnants of House Tully. A prisoner, a ghost, a dead woman, and a missing knight. This is what remains of 3 centuries of power and pride. But there is one more person who carries Tully blood. One more hope, however slim. Her name is Sansa Stark. Sansa is Catelyn's daughter. She carries Tully blood through her mother. She has the auburn hair of the Tullys. She grew up hearing stories of Riverrun and the Trident. She is the niece of Edmure Tully and the granddaughter of Hoster Tully. And unlike the others, she is young. She can still have children. She can still carry the Tully line forward. But Sansa has problems of her own. She was a hostage in King's Landing for years, married against her will to Tyrion Lannister, a marriage never consummated but binding nonetheless. She escaped with Littlefinger's help and now lives in the Vale, pretending to be his bastard daughter while he schemes to control the North through her claim. She has been betrayed repeatedly. She has watched her father die She has suffered abuse at Joffrey's hands. She has learned the hard way that the world is cruel and that honor gets you killed. Sansa is the last chance for House Tully, not just because she carries their blood, but because she carries something else. She carries the memory of her mother's strength. She carries her father's name and the loyalty that name still commands in the North. She carries the inheritance of two great houses, Stark and Tully, and if she survives the games being played around her, she might be able to use that inheritance to rebuild what was lost. But that is a big if. Sansa is still young. She is still learning how to play the Game of Thrones. She has survived this long partly through luck and partly through the protection of others. Whether she can become the kind of leader who could restore House Tully remains to be seen. Whether she even wants to is unclear. She is a Stark first, raised in Winterfell, tied to the North through memory and blood. The Riverlands are her mother's home, not hers. Would she fight to reclaim Riverrun when she has not even reclaimed Winterfell? These are questions without answers. The story is not finished. The books are not complete. We do not know what will happen to Sansa or Edmure or Lady Stoneheart or the Riverlands. We can only look at what has happened and try to understand what it means. Now we must address the theories, the speculation, the possibilities that fans have discussed for years. These are not confirmed facts. These are ideas, some more plausible than others, about how House Tully's story might continue or conclude. One popular theory concerns Edmure's future. Some fans believe that Edmure will eventually be freed from Lannister captivity and will return to the Riverlands to reclaim his birthright. The theory suggests that as the Lannister hold on power weakens, which it clearly is as their enemies multiply and their resources are stretched thin, hostages like Edmure become less valuable and more expensive to maintain. If the Lannisters fall, or if they need to make deals to survive, Edmure might be released as part of a bargain. The evidence for this theory is mostly circumstantial. Edmure is alive in the books. He has a son who carries the Tully name. The text has not forgotten him, which suggests he might still have a role to play. George R.R. Martin tends not to keep characters alive unless they serve a purpose in the story. If Edmure was meant to simply rot in a cell forever, he could have died at the Red Wedding or shortly after. The fact that he lives suggests his story is not over. But there are problems with this theory. Even if Edmure is freed, what can he actually accomplish? He's not a great military leader. His one major victory, holding the Red Fork against Tywin, actually made the strategic situation worse for his side. He is brave but not brilliant. He cares about his people but lacks the cunning to outmaneuver the predators who run Westeros. Would a freed Edmure be able to retake Riverrun from the Frys? Would he be able to unite the fractious Riverlords? Would he be able to restore House Tully to anything resembling its former position? Some fans are skeptical. They point out that Edmure has already failed once, and failure in Westeros rarely offers second chances. They argue that his character arc is complete, a tragedy of a decent man crushed by forces beyond his understanding or control. His purpose in the story might simply be to show how the innocent suffer when great lords play their games. He might remain a prisoner until the series ends, a reminder of what the Red Wedding cost, a living symbol of Tully defeat. Another theory focuses on Sansa Stark and her potential role in the Riverlands. Some fans believe that Sansa will eventually claim Riverrun through her Tully blood and become the one who restores House Tully to power. This theory suggests that after Sansa deals with her problems in the north, after she reclaims Winterfell or secures her position there, she will turn her attention south to her mother's homeland. The evidence for this includes Sansa's connection to the Riverlands through Catelyn. The River Lords knew Catelyn. Many of them fought for Robb because of the Tully alliance. They might be willing to support Catelyn's daughter, especially if the alternative is continued Frey rule. Sansa also has potential allies in the Vale through her aunt's former position and through Littlefinger's influence, for whatever that is worth. If she could combine Northern and Vale support with Riverland's loyalty to the Tully name, she might have the power to challenge the Freys and reclaim Riverrun. But this theory has weaknesses too. Sansa is a Stark, not a Tully. The River Lords might respect her mother's memory, but that does not mean they would accept Sansa as their lady. Moreover, Sansa has no experience with the Riverlands. She has never lived there. She knows the territory only through her mother's stories. Would she even want to rule Riverrun when she has a stronger claim to Winterfell? Would she divide her attention between two kingdoms when holding one is hard enough? Some fans argue that Sansa's role might not be to rule the Riverlands herself, but to install someone else. Perhaps she would free her uncle Edmure and help him retake Riverrun. Perhaps she would work to end Frey rule without claiming power for herself. This would fit with the themes of family and duty that define House Tully. Sansa helping her uncle would honor her mother's memory and fulfill the Tully words: family, duty, honor. Then there is Lady Stoneheart. Fans have spent years speculating about what her ultimate fate will be. Some believe she will die a second time after achieving her vengeance against the Freys. Some think she might somehow be redeemed or made human again, though this seems unlikely given how the magic of resurrection works in this world. Some believe she will play a crucial role in the endgame, perhaps sacrificing herself to save one of her children or to accomplish something that the living Catelyn could not. The most interesting theories about Lady Stoneheart involve her connection to the larger story. Some fans note that she now commands the Brotherhood without banners, a group that was once noble but has become something darker under her leadership. The Brotherhood used to protect the innocent and oppose tyranny. Now they hang people without trial and kill based on association rather than actual guilt. This transformation mirrors what has happened to the Riverlands themselves and to the ideals that House Tully supposedly represented. Some readers believe Lady Stoneheart represents the ultimate cost of the Red Wedding. Not just the immediate deaths, but the corruption of everything that came after. Catelyn was once a woman who valued honor and family above all else. She tried to do the right thing, even when it was hard. She loved her children and worked to protect them. Now she is vengeance incarnate, incapable of mercy, destroying rather than building. The theory suggests that Lady Stoneheart must die a final death so that the land can heal. As long as she walks, spreading terror and violence, the Riverlands cannot move past the trauma of the Red Wedding. Her death might be necessary for peace, but other fans see it differently. They argue that Lady Stoneheart is not a villain, but a force of justice in a world that has forgotten what justice means. The Freys violated the most sacred laws of hospitality. They murdered a king at a wedding. They betrayed every oath they had ever sworn, and the crown rewarded them for it. The Lannisters gave them lands and titles. No one was punished. No one faced consequences. In a world where such crimes go unanswered, perhaps a monster like Lady Stoneheart is necessary. Perhaps she is the only justice the small folk will ever see. These fans believe Lady Stoneheart might actually help restore order to the Riverlands by eliminating the Freys and creating space for better rulers to emerge. Her methods are brutal, but so is Westeros. You do not defeat people like Walder Frey and Rose Bolton with gentle words and noble ideals. You defeat them with fear and steel, and Lady Stoneheart has plenty of both. There is also speculation about the Brotherhood without Banners itself and its future. Under Beric Dondarrion, the Brotherhood was a force for good, protecting the small folk and fighting for the common people against lords who exploited them. Under Lady Stoneheart, they have become executioners and terrorists. But what happens after Lady Stoneheart is gone? Does the Brotherhood return to its original mission? Do they disband? Do they become something new? Some fans theorize that the Brotherhood will play a crucial role in the final battles of the series. They know the Riverlands better than any organized army. They have support among the small folk. They could be vital allies against whatever threats emerge in the story's endgame, whether those threats are the Lannisters, the White Walkers, or something else entirely. Then there are the broader political theories about the Riverlands' future. Some fans believe the Riverlands will never again be independent. They will always be ruled by some larger kingdom because their geography makes independence impossible. They sit at the center of Westeros, and whoever controls them controls the ability to move armies across the continent. No king, whether on the Iron Throne or ruling from Winterfell or Highgarden, will allow the Riverlands to be independent, because independent Riverlands would be too dangerous. Others disagree. They point out that the Riverlands were never truly independent, even under Tully rule. They were always part of a larger kingdom, first under the Ironborn and Storm Kings, then under the Targaryens, then under Robert Baratheon. But that does not mean they were powerless. The Tullys had significant influence. They had a voice at court. They controlled their own internal affairs. The question is not whether the Riverlands will be independent, but whether they will be ruled by Riverlanders or by outsiders. This is where theories about the Freys become important. House Frey now holds Riverrun and claims authority over the Riverlands. But everyone knows this situation is unstable. The Freys are hated. They have no legitimacy beyond the swords that keep them in power. The moment those swords are withdrawn, Frey rule will collapse. So the question becomes, what will replace it? Some fans believe the Freys will be destroyed completely, wiped out as House Rain was wiped out. Lady Stoneheart is already working toward this goal, killing Freys wherever she finds them. If she or someone else manages to eliminate the entire Frey line, Riverrun would be empty. Someone would have to take control. That someone might be Edmure if he is freed. It might be Sansa or another Stark. It might be some other River Lord who emerges as a leader. But the Freys cannot hold what they have taken forever. Their days are numbered. Other fans are less optimistic. They believe House Frey will survive, diminished but intact, because Westeros rarely sees complete justice. The Freys have powerful allies. They have the crown's backing. They have castles and armies. Yes, they are hated, but hatred alone does not overthrow lords. The small folk can hate all they want. Without armies and leadership, their hatred means nothing. The phrase might hold Riverrun for generations, slowly earning acceptance through time and intermarriage, until people forget the Red Wedding, or at least stop caring about it. This darker interpretation fits the themes of A Song of Ice and Fire. George R.R. Martin rarely gives readers the clear moral victories they want. The Lannisters have prospered despite their crimes. The Boltons held the North for a time, despite their treachery. Why would the phrase be different? Perhaps the lesson is that in Westeros, evil often wins, and the good die young, and justice is a luxury that most people never see. But there is one more theory worth discussing, perhaps the most important one for House Tully's future. It concerns the words of the house: family, duty, honor. Throughout House Tully's history, these words have guided their actions. Family came first. Hoster Tully proved this by marrying his daughters to secure alliances, even when it meant forcing Lisa to abort a child. Duty came second. The Tullys always did their duty to the Iron Throne, even when that duty was costly or cruel. Honor came last, not because it was unimportant, but because it was a luxury that could only be afforded after family and duty were secure. Some fans believe this hierarchy was House Tully's fatal flaw. They argue that by putting honor last, the Tullys created a moral weakness that their enemies exploited. They were so focused on pragmatism and survival that they forgot why survival mattered. They maintained their position for 3 centuries. But what did they build that lasted? What did they create that was worth preserving? When the crisis came, when Robb Stark needed them most, the Tullys followed their usual pattern. They did their duty. They protected their family. But they did not inspire the kind of absolute loyalty that might have prevented the Red Wedding. Contrast this with House Stark. The Starks put honor first. This got many of them killed. Ned's honor got him executed. Robb's honor made him break his oath to the Frys and marry Jane Westerling. But the Starks' honor also earned them something the Tullys never had: genuine love from their people. The North remembers. The Northern Lords might betray each other, but they never forget the Starks. They wait for a Stark to return. They dream of Stark restoration. And in the books, that loyalty is beginning to bear fruit as conspiracies form to overthrow the Boltons and return the North to its rightful rulers. No one is conspiring to restore the Tullys. The Riverlands suffer under Frey rule, but they are not organizing resistance to bring Edmure back. They do not dream of Tully restoration the way the North dreams of Stark restoration. Perhaps this is because the Tullys never gave their people something to believe in beyond basic competence and pragmatic governance. They survived, but they did not inspire. The theory, then, is that House Tully fell not because they were weak or stupid, but because they built their house on sand. They prioritized survival over meaning. They chose pragmatism over principle. And when the real test came, when they needed their people to stand with them against impossible odds, those people had no reason to die for Tully ideals, because the Tullys had never clearly articulated what those ideals were, beyond staying alive and maintaining power. If House Tully is to rise again, the theory goes, it must be built differently. It must be built on something stronger than calculated marriages and careful neutrality and doing duty for duty's sake. It must inspire loyalty through genuine virtue, not just competent administration. It must give the Riverlands something worth fighting for. Could Sansa do this? Could Edmure? Could anyone? That is the question the theory leaves unanswered, because perhaps House Tully's story is not about restoration at all. Perhaps it is about the limits of pragmatism and the cost of putting survival above all else. Perhaps the lesson is that houses built solely on practical considerations cannot endure when the world turns truly dark. As we reach the end of House Tully's story, at least as far as we know it, we are left with questions rather than answers. Will Edmure ever return to Riverrun? Will Sansa reclaim her mother's homeland? Will the Freys be destroyed, or will they endure? Will the Riverlands ever heal from the wounds of the War of the Five Kings? Will House Tully be remembered as a great house that fell to treachery, or as a cautionary tale about the dangers of valuing survival over virtue? We do not know. The story is unfinished. The books are incomplete. All we can do is look at what has happened and try to understand what it means. What we know for certain is this: House Tully rose through a calculated gamble on the dragons. They survived for 3 centuries through pragmatism and careful politics. They fell through a combination of bad luck, bad decisions, and the treachery of men who valued power over every law of gods and men. They were destroyed, not in glorious battle, but in a dining hall at a wedding, murdered while they ate and drank under guest-right. This is the legacy of House Tully. Not glory, not triumph, not even noble defeat, just betrayal and broken bodies, and a castle that flies a different banner now. Just a prisoner in the west, and a ghost in the wilderness, and a dead woman walking the riverbanks. Just the memory of what used to be, and the fading hope that someday, somehow, it might be restored. Family, duty, honor. The words of House Tully. They followed those words for 300 years. Whether those words were enough, whether they chose the right order, whether they built something worth preserving, these are questions each reader must answer for themselves. The Riverlands wait, they suffer, they endure, just as they always have, just as they always will, because the Riverlands are the heart of Westeros, and hearts keep beating even when they are broken. The question is not whether the Riverlands will survive. They always survive. The question is whether House Tully will survive with them. Only time will tell. Only the pages yet to be written will give us our answer. Until then, we remember. We remember what they were. We remember what they lost. And we wonder what they might yet become. If you have your own theories about House Tully's fate, about what the Red Wedding meant, about whether the Riverlands can heal, and whether the trout banners will ever fly over Riverrun again, share them in the comments below. The story of Westeros belongs to all of us who read it and think about it and argue about what it means. And if you want more deep dives into the great houses of Westeros, into the histories and mysteries that make this world so rich and complex, you know what to do. Subscribe and join us for more journeys through the 7 kingdoms and beyond. The Tullys may have fallen, but their story is not over yet.